Awesome. I think we're on, Moss. Let's
Awesome.
give Facebook a second to make sure that we actually are live, and once we can see ourselves streaming in the group. Awesome. So let's assume we're on. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, property investors. Today we're here with Moss, who will be talking about how to avoid the serviceability trap. And so when the banks won't lend you any more money, this is an exciting topic, and I can't wait to hear more from you, Moss. Tell us, what is the serviceability trap that we often hear about, and it's often a big problem for a lot of investors. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people are, to everyone, Facebook family and friends. So serviceability trap is something that is very close to my heart, and I always wanted to talk to people about this. And it is when the bank usually says a big fat no to you when you go back to the bank asking for more money. So you're continuing on your property journey, and next thing you know, you've reached your serviceability ceiling, which means that the bank thinks that you don't have enough cash flow to service the loans. Now, you'll often hear me saying that property is all about cash flow. So, and this is where the frustration comes in. You have a lot of equity sitting with the bank. You can see that the money is there. You can pay a deposit, but the bank still says no. And usually this happens, when you have acquired 2 properties already. So, and it's usually the 3rd property that you're about to buy. And that's why I always say that, property is a very generous sort of, investment class, always allows you to make 2 mistakes. The 3rd one is where it will usually penalize you. So, most people are quite lucky, that in their lifetime, they would, be buying 2 or 3 properties. But majority of the times you would only hear from people who have acquired a number of properties, but always keep this thinking in your head that it's not so much about how many properties you hold. It's about the optimum level of the portfolio. What's the valuation of the portfolio? Always challenge and ask that question back. What does the growth look like, and what does the valuation look like of the portfolio?
Yeah, awesome. And you mentioned, Moss, about 2 mistakes that the typical investor makes, or that the industry only allows them to make. Tell us about these 2 mistakes.
Well, the 2 mistakes basically means that you can buy 2 properties. It's as simple as that. So you can buy 2 properties, whether they are good or bad. It will not materially impact where you are in your life. Either you would continue to be where you are, or you would exponentially grow. So when I say 2 mistakes, that means that, you can buy 2 properties and still buy the 3rd one and recover from the 2, worst mistakes or worst acquisitions that you have done and still come out on the top. Or you could avoid those 2 properties and buy the right properties in the first place and continue your property growth cycle. So.
Awesome. And why do property investors fall into this this trap, whether they like it or not? It's something that keeps coming up. Yeah.
So, and this is interesting. So property investors have this sort of fake economy created around them, where, they keep hearing that, you can buy as many properties as you can. You would see media, property gurus, property profits educators talking about this, this financial freedom and, 3 to 5 years to acquire financial freedom and 10 properties in 10 years. And but you need to stop and think that media's job is to entertain, not educate. Yeah, so I always tend to, reflect on that thinking again and again. So they are there to entertain, not so much to educate you. So again, the number does not matter. What matters is that real estate or the property investing is not there to get rich quickly.
Yeah.
The data and experience, my data and experience says that you need at least, 7.5 years roughly to be financially free, whether you go through buy and hold strategy or whether you go through small scale developments. Now, small scale developments usually compresses this, life cycle from 7.5 years to probably like 6 years, if you are doing the right thing. So the buyers fall into this majority of the times because their income is finite. It comes down to that, yeah? And sooner or later, bank would block them from acquiring that property. Now, what's worse is in order to maximize their borrowing, what they'll do is they'll try to buy a cheap, non-investment grade property because there is just, 200,000 or 150,000 left for them to use. So they'll buy a land, or they'll just try to use that to buy something because they have this thing in their head that, the number matters. It's not so much about the valuation or the growth. So, or the worst stuff is that they'll try to create more income by, working more hours or, sacrificing their vivid lifestyle to buy that extra one property, only to realize that now they're even worse off because they have a worse lifestyle. They've added a property which is not going anywhere, and the bank is still not lending them any more money. So yeah, so that cycle keeps coming back, it never stops.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's something that a lot of people they think this is just the way it is. What do you think a lot of investors aren't aware, or why aren't more people aware of how to avoid this this trap? And for the viewers out there, if you're watching us live now, do comment with your questions so that we'll be answering them within this Facebook Live. So make sure you do comment any questions you might have, and I'll make sure we cover that today. But yeah, Maz, what do you think so many people are unaware about this problem?
Yeah, and it's quite funny. I actually believe that people are aware. It's just that they are not proactively thinking and planning it accordingly. Okay. So it is in their back of their mind that, I don't have a money tree in my backyard where I shake and the money falls off and, the money keeps coming in. So they know that the money is finite. It's just that by the time they start thinking about this, or people start interrogating themselves about this, it's just because they have heard a no from a broker or their bank already. So it's a reactive approach to the problem, not a proactive approach to the problem. And this is where, I'll say something very controversial, and, feel free to, make a comment or, and tell me whether this is right or wrong thinking, is that people would have, cash available to them because they might have created some equity in some of the property that they've bought. But there is no borrowing, so there's no serviceability. And this is where all these property prophets and gurus and educators come into play, where, they'll cash this thinking to say, okay, let us educate you more so that you can go out and, and solve this problem. Whereas what they are doing is they are basically solving their own problem by creating cash flow streams for themselves while investing it back into the property development. So it's a sad and honest reality, but that's the cycle that, people always fall into.
Yeah, I hear you. And for those who might not be aware, how did you come across this problem yourself, and what was your experience like facing this problem?
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to pretend that, I'm the smart one here. A wise man, said that, if you're in a room full of people and you're the smartest one in the room, you're definitely in the wrong room. And you're hanging out with the wrong crowd. So I never claimed to be the smartest one in the crowd. But look, I'll share my experience, and everything that I've learned is the hard way. And luckily, I always say that, touch wood, that I haven't made any expensive mistakes, and I do not fear to admit that. That I've kept making the right decisions. I've always helped myself realize how to break out of these things, or hindsight and reflect, and keep checking things out as to where I am in the property life cycle. What does that mean? It means that sometimes you would do the right thing and sometimes you would do the wrong thing. It's more that if you're reflecting of what your mistakes are, it is helping you bouncing back quite quickly. So also, before we get into the story and how did I discover the solution, one thing to always that I always tell people is to reflect on is, if you think that you are never failing and you're always successful, then you haven't hit your true potential, because failure is the best success. Anyways, look, let me share my story. So look, I was very much like anyone out there on the property journey. anchored by the thinking that, you know, property grabbing or the number of properties is the way to go. Bought my first property in early 20s, you know, kept accumulating it till I heard that big fat NO from the bank and the broker. Yep. And, you know, and mind you that, you know, at that time, you know, interest rates were 9%, 9.5%. So, you know, you would hear that no very quickly from the bank. I exactly did what most people would do, you know, so, you know, sacrifice my work-life balance, you know, 3 jobs, trying to make extra money, only to get some extra serviceability, went out, bought myself a land, and yeah, on paper, everything was looking good, but I realized that, you know, I've sacrificed my lifestyle, and I know that bank is not going to now lend me any money to do any more construction. So, yeah, now, what I'm going to say here is that, and I promise this, there was no calculation involved at that time. It was a pure fluke at that time, that while I was building my own portfolio, I ended up acquiring some property which had development potential in it. I had no idea, no clue as to what that means at that time. I had some really good people, some really good, you know, team around me, or my mentors, should I say, you know, who guided me at that time. Yeah, I could free up some capital. So I had some cash flow sitting on the side, so I could free up some capital in line of credit. And I used that development potential property to run a development approval on that property. It was a typical splitter block. And I'll quickly explain to you what a splitter block is. So you are saving the house at the front and building a couple of houses at the back. And that's what I ended up doing. So I put a DA, I had the money, I put the DA, I put the subdivision. It was enough money for me to do all of that. And basically I ended up selling the front house, which basically deleveraged me, gave me the land at the back at a wholesale price. And I took that land back to the bank and said, hey, bank, you know, now that I've sold the front, I have a lot more equity in the asset that's sitting there. I have better serviceability now. How about you give me some more money? And that's where the bank looked at, you know, the project and said, yep, that makes sense. We'll give you the construction money. Go ahead, do the construction. Yeah, I built those two products or 2 townhouses. They were at wholesale prices. And yeah, so there was some good yield coming out of that. I ended up selling those, making some profit. And I realized, oh, okay, so this makes sense. So anytime when I'm stuck into any of these scenarios, I need to have this, you know, should I say, a wild card in my portfolio where I can pull one of these properties out and run a DA on these properties or development approval on these properties, unlock myself out of these serviceability traps, move forward, and then quickly come back and repeat and redo it again. So yeah, so once I, you know, aced this strategy, I started doing a lot more detailed feasibilities. I started doing a lot of due diligence when I was about to acquire one of these properties, so that I knew as to how to acquire them and what does that mean in relation to, you know, development potential properties. More so, I started using up SMSF and leveraging that to hold some of these properties as well. So yes, you know, there are strategies, and look, feel free to, you know, reach out to your own accountants and, you know, seek your own financial advice. I always say that to people. But yeah, I could park some of these properties in SMSF and pull them out. And yes, there was all these stamp duty implications in there, but still it was a good way for me to unlock out of the serviceability trap that I would always hit, you know, when I was moving on a growth strategy.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Fantastic. And what were some of the things that you wish you had known as you're going into it? And guys, for the viewers out there, again, if you resonate with any of the situations that Mons is talking about, or if you have your own questions, make sure you do comment. Who have we got here? We've got Basharat, Azim, how you doing? Make sure you do comment any questions you have so we can answer it here. But yes, Mons, what were some of the things that that you wish you would have known or looked into a little bit more as you're going through that process of unlocking your serviceability potential?
Yeah, so I mean, the challenges are pretty simple. Yeah, at that time, the first property was a fluke. I realized that it was a development potential, but then as I started, you know, acting on the strategy, what I wanted to do was to take this guess game out of acquiring a development potential property. So doing that detailed feasibility before upfront, before I acquire this property, making sure that I'm 100% know, how can you develop this property? What are some strategies that I can use to unlock the equity in these properties, manufacture and force my own growth, so that every time I hit the serviceability trap, I have this money sitting on the side that I can use to run these days on these properties, and then pull myself out. So yeah, so that was one of those biggest challenges. As I started accumulating some of these, how to do the feasibility, what to look for, what is the due diligence, what would council say, how to understand the building envelopes. I think a lot of these came into play to solve this real problem for myself.
Yeah, and Mos, I know that a lot of investors come to you with inquiries, and many of them are in different positions. Can you share a little bit about some of the positions that the people that inquire with you, where they're at, and what are some of the typical questions that they inquire about when they're looking at unlocking their serviceability potential?
Yeah, and look, I think what happens is majority of the time people are reactive, and that's why one of the reasons I'm out here today educating people is telling them that they should be thinking about this before buying that last property, before they're going to hit their threshold or the serviceability cap or the serviceability ceiling. Majority of the time when a person has come to me, they are about to buy their last property, which is the final property which is going to hit their serviceability cap, and they're stuck there. So it limits your moves as to how good of a development opportunity or development property you could buy. It limits on the areas, it limits on the focus. So there's a lot of things that you need to consider. So I always tend to tell people, think about these things up front in your property journey or a property life cycle, rather than waiting for this to happen at the very end. And then never wait for the market's mercy to provide the growth to you. Have the strategy such that you can create your own equity and your own growth as you move along the property journey. People tend to buy and hold and sit for 2 to 3 years for the market to respond. If you have seen the property life cycle, if you have picked the property at the peak or the trough, you would have to wait quite a number of years before you come out of those cycles. So if you are developing, or if you're doing small scale developments, or if you've added these properties in your portfolio, even if you're not actively developing, what you're doing is that you are not waiting at the mercy of the market. You're setting up yourself for success, even if the market is not responding.
Fantastic. And so you mentioned a few things there. One, they need to look into a few things. What are some of those things specifically that they should be looking into prior? And I know we're going to go into this a little bit deeper shortly. You mentioned they need to look into a few things, and that's prior to it, and not wait for the market. So some of them hold on for 3 to 5 years before doing anything. What are some of the things that they should be looking into right now, that they can look into right now?
And so if I give you, like, say, I call them hacks, or 3 hacks to avoid a situation like this. Basically what you're doing is, early in the property life cycle, you need to start thinking about some of these things, so that you're not, making these decisions or acquiring these development potential properties while your hand is twisted by the bank. So that's number 1. Number 2 is understand, what can you do with that development potential property. Have a plan up front, do a detailed feasibility, engage someone who could do a detailed feasibility for you. Understand as to how are you going to manufacture equity or growth in these properties. Doesn't have to be right now, it could be in the future, but have a plan in place. Is it a splitter block? Is it a drop and rebuild? Is it a renovation? Is it an extension? There's a lot of ways you can, manufacture the equity and come out of, some of these, serviceability traps. And third, and the most important thing, balance your portfolio by adding growth with yield. Anyone who just thinks about yield or thinks about adding just properties, you would have to wait a long time before the growth comes through. So identify the right market predictors so that you can buy in the growth corridors and the growth pockets. And so you don't have to, wait a really, really long time. Don't sacrifice your vivid lifestyle just because you are, passionate about the property, the idea of investing is so that you can still enjoy your life. It's not so much about just creating the wealth while you're not enjoying the life. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's some great gems there, Moss, and for a lot of people, I know for myself, some of the gems that you're given here can be quite, especially if it's new to us, it can brush over us real quickly. Can you recap what's the first thing that the first piece of advice you want to give people as to how to overcome or avoid the serviceability trap? What's the first thing?
Ask the question again. Let me contemplate.
Yeah. So just as I'll recap that question, we've got Mason here who's saying great. We've got Vipul here who's saying great info, and thanks guys. Make sure you do comment if you have any questions. So the question I had, Moss. So you've given a few different things here. What's the first thing that they need to consider? I think it was looking at what are the few things that they need to look into and not wait 3 to 5 years. Well, what's that first thing that they should do, just to recap and make it simple?
The first thing that every property investor should always do is assess their portfolio a lot more than what they should normally do. Don't assess the portfolio when you're ready to make an acquisition. Naturally keep assessing your portfolio every 6 months, 12 months to see where you are sitting. Where's the valuation sitting? How are you tracking? Don't be scared of remediating the portfolio. People are scared to admit their mistakes. And I see that time and time again. People come to me and say, Moss, I have these 3 properties. This one property hasn't done anything for me in the past 7 years. And I said, well, what are you waiting for? Miracles don't happen to normal people like us, so let's not wait for the miracle to happen. Take decisions, take actions. If you know that there is nothing happening in this space, clearly you've made a mistake, admit it, remediate, move on, and do something better with it, So, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So first thing, guys, is assess your portfolio. And you mentioned a couple of things around that is if your property is not performing, what things should they be looking at inside their portfolio specifically that would help them identify whether they're on the right or wrong track, or whether to do something about it when they're assessing their portfolio?
Well, the important thing is that how has the portfolio tracked over a couple of years? How is the growth coming along? How is the suburb done against your portfolio? How is the street done against your portfolio? People fall into this self-serving bias here, where they think, oh, I have done the right thing. I just have to wait to get the rewards and the return. And you see growth happening across. And look, I am one of you. I've bought some of these properties where the growth happened around me, and the growth might not happen on the street. And there was something definitely that you would have missed in that street or in that particular pocket. So learn to remediate. It's the decision making and the action that would always keep you abreast, or keep you at the front of the curve rather than at the back of the curve.
Yeah, awesome. So for a lot of people who might have property that may have development potential, or maybe they're not aware on how to actually assess their portfolio, what would you advise them, and what would you tell them to do at this point in order for them to be able to assess their portfolio? Maybe they are just hanging on and waiting until something happens. What would you advise them to do? Because for a lot of people, I know they aren't aware on how to compare the growth in their properties, and they are just waiting until something happens. What would you advise them on how to?
If you have hit the serviceability trap, there's a few ways you can go about doing this. So the first way is, look in your own backyard. What properties do you hold? If you're holding 3, 4, 5 properties, there's a good chance that one of them might be a development potential property that you never knew of. You could improve the value of that property by doing something, whether through renovation, extension, or something, So when you're assessing the portfolio, don't just assess from a growth perspective, but also assess from the high best use of the portfolio or a particular property. Can you, put something at the back? Is it a splitter block? Does the zoning allow you to do something? So, if you can't make those assessments, engage a professional, and show them the portfolio and tell them, well, is there any property that I can do something with? And if you can't, then that's fine too, then remediate, understand, what is the best way to get out of these, serviceability traps, so that you can release some of that serviceability back to you, rather than sacrificing your lifestyle and then jumping it from there. So
yeah, fantastic.
yeah.
And we've got Matthew here. Yes, Matthew. So after the live, you'll be able to watch this right from the beginning. And great insight, Moss. So for those who are unsure on how to actually assess their portfolio, speak to an expert, inquire. And for some who are wondering, why should I inquire? Why should I bother going through these, investigating or even assessing my portfolio to see what kind of value, even if they are experiencing the serviceability trap? I know you shared a case study the other week, and there are many different examples. But what are the type of results that investors can achieve by unlocking this serviceability trap with development potential? What type of results? I know you shared a case study the other day.
Look, ultimately, small-scale developments is the way to go forward, when it comes to property journey. I always see it as a life cycle. So buy and hold strategy, yes, it's good for an early investor, or, an investor who has just started their portfolio. But ultimately, you want to go in that direction of, small-scale developments, or, splitted blocks or renovations. Let's start, improving your appetite and start growing in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some investors might say and think that, well, this is very self-serving, and Moss is only talking about a single strategy, and then that's true as well, because if you look at it, some people have acquired a lot of properties by using a high yield strategy. And what I tend to say there is that they would have acquired properties which are higher in the yield or higher in the income that they're generating, and the bank would look at them favorably, so that they can get more properties at the back end. But those are very hand few. What usually happens with is yield and growth are not always parallel to each other. They would always coincide to each other. So high yield comes with slightly lower growth, but don't quote me on that, because there are areas where high yield and high growth can be achieved as well. But I'm talking more in a general sense that yield and growth are usually, indirectly correlated, or, indirectly correlated to each other. But what people tend to do is, they would go into some of the more complicated strategies around roaming houses, NDIS, to create more income for themselves. What these properties or these strategies don't offer is growth. And what I tend to tell people, especially if you are in your early property life cycle, focus on growth more rather than yield, because growth is what would get you out of the rat race. Yield is going to just earn an income to you and still keep you in the rat race. So what you want to do is pay it off, and pay it off quick. And the growth or capital growth is what's going to get you there. Now, this strategy might not be for everyone, and you have to understand that, for you to deliver on these, what are the scares, what are the objections? Yeah, so you need to have a good team beside you to help you find these gems, to place your property portfolio such that, you're making the right decisions. Now, there are courses out there which teaches you, how to do developments, and people would say, oh, you can do these courses, and there's, you can do the no money down deals and all that stuff. And let me tell you from my experience, there's no such thing as money down deals. It's a complete myth. When it comes to no money down deals, basically the way you are thinking is more from a small scale property development perspective. There is three things that's always crucial in any property deal or any property development. You're looking at cash or equity, you're looking at serviceability, and you're looking at experience. Where the confusion happens is that the property profits usually would confuse you by saying, well, it's not so much experience, it's the education. So if you have the education, then that's fine. You're bringing in value to the deal. Yeah. Now, let me tell you, and let me dawn this, and reflect on this. Do you think someone would hand over $500,000 or $1 million to you just because you're educated? You can't even get a job when you get an education. The experience is the key to get some of these things going. And that's what's really, really important. Having the right team beside you to learn hands-on experience is the key to get the growth going, rather than stopping and buying and holding. Some of these are very vanilla strategies.
And Mars, can you share to put this into perspective for them so that they can understand what the numbers look like practically for their current situations? What's the difference between? I remember you mentioned someone mentioned to you their property grew 50% over 5 years versus what kind of potential could someone access in terms of growth through development potential? What's the difference between
Definitely.
that 50% growth versus what can they achieve through development?
Definitely. So when you're looking at developments, what you're looking at is, margins on cost or profit margin on cost. A typical property would give you somewhere between 5% to 7% a year. That's what you're looking at. A good property, that's what you're looking at. So, in 5 years' time, you might be looking at 30 to 40%, 50%. That's a good selection of properties. Majority of the people are not even able to achieve that. What small scale development does is that you're looking at 20 to 30% on cost, just within the first 2 years. So the cash on cash returns, you're looking at somewhere between 70 all the way to 120%, depending on how you're doing the projects. Now, again, you need a good team in place and you need the confidence to deliver some of these projects. Now, you don't always think from that perspective when you're doing small scale developments. Yes, there's healthy profits in there. You don't need to take it all the way through. You just need these gems to be parked in your portfolio so that every time you hit a serviceability trap, you can pull this wildcat out, run a DA, get that team involved again, run a DA, get yourself out of the serviceability trap and go back in. Ultimately, what you would realize is that this small scale development is not the black hole that people talk about. It's relatively a lot easier than what people make it look like. And you would get the comfortableness and the confidence to go ahead and start doing these small scale developments yourself.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of how much you've been able to how much potential from a small scale development you've been able to unlock versus if you hadn't done that, what would have happened? So how much specifically were you able, or have you been able to see unlocked through these strategies?
Look, I'll talk in numbers and percentages. I don't like boasting about myself,
and let's give it. I know you don't like boasting about it, but for the purpose of the viewers who are considering their properties right now, they know what it's worth. They might be experiencing the serviceability trap, but just to let them know what actually is potentially available for them through something like this.
Yes. So I'll use one of our projects as an example. We acquired the project at around 700,000. It was a splitter block. When we subdivided and sold the front sold for about 600,000. So we were holding the land at the back for roughly about 100,000 plus some civil. There was no holding cost per se because it was tenanted all the way through. Now, we quickly de-leveraged myself, and this is the story that I'm reflecting on my own self. We quickly de-leveraged so that, the bank can give us more money. And then once we started building at the back, it costed us roughly about 520,000 to build something at the back. Add an extra 100,000, that's 620. Add holding cost, probably another 40, that's, 660. Let's round it to 700. Each of those units were valued at 700,000 each. So we were unlocking probably about 700,000 in total from the deal itself. Now, if you look at end to end, what we did is we managed the risk, in that 2 years. We sold the lot at the front, still making more than what the market would have offered for that lot in that 2 years time anyway. So if when I reflected and I went back and I said, okay, this was a $700,000 block that I bought, or $680,000 block that I bought. If I would have sold it 2 years down the track, what would I've got it for? And I would have still got it probably like 800, 850. So I was making almost twice of, what I would have been getting from a buy and hold strategy. Mm-hmm. Now, the numbers not always work in that scenario, but what I tend to tell people, especially when they're looking for these gems or looking for these development properties, it's a simple maths opportunity. You need to buy the land at a wholesale price and you need to build the properties at a wholesale price. So that's what the thinking is. and you're selling the final stock at the retail price. So that magical number between, you know, the buy price and the sell price is between 3. So, you know, when people talk about how do you do feasibility, is without going into too much detail, and probably we'll set up another session to, you know, go through feasibilities and how to do feasibilities. But if you are buying, say, for example, a property for $1 million, which is a development potential property, ultimately the final product that you should be selling should be more than $3 million. You know, so there should be 1-to-3 ratio for you to make any money in that deal. You know, and you know, and that is me talking more from an experience perspective. So yeah, so if you're looking at, you know, really high level, whether this is a development potential property, understand what you can put on that property, you know, understand the building envelope, and then, you know, calculate the gross realized value. What are you going to sell the final product for, and what are you buying the land for? And that differential between the two, if that's more than the 3 integer, you know, it's a good deal to have. Again, I'm making it very simple. There's a lot of due diligence that goes in place. So, you know, don't just go by that almost set 3. Let's just go ahead and buy these properties where the number sticks at 3. There is zone planning schemes, there is height restrictions, you know, point of discharges, civil, all those things need to consider before you're making these informed decisions.
Yeah, fantastic, Moss. I appreciate you sharing that. So if I recap the steps, the first thing you mentioned was number 1, assess your portfolio, see what growth you might have a look at what development projects might be available for that, for the properties that they have. What's the second thing you'd advise it? Because you've mentioned a lot of value here, a lot of insights. What's the second thing you'd recommend?
Well, the second thing is that think about adding these gems to your portfolio early in your property journey. Don't wait for the ceiling to, you know, to hit, or for the bank to say no before you start thinking about some of these things. Add these in your portfolio earlier in the pace, so that when you are coming in closer to hitting the serviceability trap, and I guarantee you would, because everyone does, then you have a way to come out of this. So more proactive thinking.
Yep. Okay, cool. So I'm going to type that in there. Add property development potential properties early on in your investment journey. Awesome. So what kind of things can they do to be able to identify these types of properties? I know you mentioned looking at, if you're acquiring a 1 million, you're looking at selling at 3 million. Is there anything else you'd advise around that step as to what they need to look for when they're considering adding these types of gems, which is property development potential properties, into their investment portfolio early on in the journey?
Yeah, and look, there's a detailed steps involved around how to do a feasibility, and you know, we can potentially I can talk a whole hour, you know, about feasibilities, and you know, what can we achieve and how do we assess a property. But you know, if you talk really high level, what you're trying to understand is, if you run a project, if you develop a project on this property, can you unlock that property money right now? So I'll put it in very, very simple terms. You know, when you're looking at the property, what you are thinking is, well, if I buy this property today and the architect can do the drawings for me today, and the council is going to approve a DA on this today and give me a building permit today, and the builder builds it today, and the real estate can sell it today, do I make a profit today? So that's the sort of lens that you're looking at when you're looking at these development potential properties. It's all about today. You're not looking at future growth. If you can make the money today, any future growth that comes in is usually icing on the cake, you know. So
yeah, awesome. So looking at your numbers to identify whether you can make a profit as it stands today, and then looking at growth as just icing on top along the way.
correct.
Awesome. Cool. So what's the third thing that you've mentioned? I'll recap for those who have just joined in. The first step is, number 1, you want to assess your property portfolio and see where it stands at the moment in terms of growth and value as it stands. And then number 2, which incorporates with number 1, have a look at what potential for small scale developments you have in your existing portfolio, and then adding property with development potential into your portfolio early on. So don't wait. What's the third thing you want to mention for people to be able to unlock their serviceability potential?
Yeah. And the third thing that I always tell people is that don't just focus on yield and vacancy rates. Yeah, think about the growth, because the growth is what's going to end the rat race for you. So, especially when you have 20 to 30 years more to go, in your work life, focusing yield is, I always say, is a retirement strategy. It's not a strategy for people who are looking to, grow and build their portfolio. Growth is what's going to build your portfolio quicker. Yield, yes, would help you get more money, because people usually look at yield and say, okay, this is cash coming in and the bank is going to look at it favorably to give me more money. Okay, so you have to add a lot of properties with yield, with significant yield, so that bank can start looking at it favorably. These properties, all they're doing is this: they're just providing cash flow for the bank to assess and give you more money in the serviceability instance. Longer strategy to play, you would rather go through the small scale development, put these properties on the side, and quickly play this wildcard, come out of it, do it again. So I always felt that adding yield properties did not get me the growth I desired. I always wanted the growth to come in. The yield usually follows the small scale development anyway, because you're building the properties at a wholesale price. Usually the yield for these properties is significantly high. So even if you are building and going down the route of small scale development, at the end of the development, you can choose to hold these properties with high yields, and you can start generating income through them. So, I mean, when people ask me, Moss, how many properties you hold, I tend to always tell them that, well, my ultimate retirement strategy when I'm ready to retire would be, I'll do one last development, which would probably be 10 or 20 blocks, and I'll just, hold all of them, and that's my cash flow. So, yeah.
Yep. So to recap that last part, I've written down growth properties over yield. Is that right? Or
well, balancing the growth and yield is very important. Don't just focus on yield, because people are just, they always talk about yield vacancy rate, yield vacancy rate. Well, you need to talk about growth and understand the growth predictors or the market predictors of what the growth corridors look like.
Yeah, awesome. So great 3 steps. Number 1, assess your current property portfolio. Have a look at where it's at in terms of growth and whether you have development, small scale development potential in your portfolio at the moment. That'll help you unlock your serviceability potential with the right team. And then second thing is adding these types of properties into your portfolio early on in the journey, and being able to identify, you mentioned the rule of 1 into 3. If you're acquiring at $1 million, you're looking to sell at least $3 million to have it feasible, and that's just a basic recommendation. It's not something you suggest. There's a lot of things that go into it. And the last thing is balancing and ensuring you look for growth properties and not just the yield. For the small discussions that we've had over the time, I've recognized there are a lot of people who have this potential, but unsure, or they're sitting on the fence and they're not really doing anything about it, and this potential just gets set aside because they don't know who to speak to or what to do, and it just becomes overwhelming. What are some of the common things that you see with investors who have this potential but unsure what to do about it? What are the things that people often misunderstand or are confused about, maybe?
And there are 2 types of people that have usually come across. There are people who are quite informed and know how property development works, and they've tried to find these properties, but they couldn't because either they're over analyzing or they're paralysis analysis sort of situation, and it's quite sad that they lose a lot of time trying to reach a decision, and then when they come to you, they haven't excelled, and they could have done so much better in that 1 to 2 years while they kept, when they say that, they're educating, or, they're self-educating themselves. So that's one sort of class, Then there's other sort of class who knows nothing about these things, and this is an eye-opener for them. Where their sort of nervousness comes into play is, well, how do you know that the council is going to say yes? Or how do you know that this is going to happen? Well, trust me, I'm not the first one who's doing property development. There are massive developers out there who do land subdivisions, and you are one of those people who would have actually bought some of these lands from these land subdivisions. So it's not a new concept. It's always been there. All you're doing is just minimizing the scale. So you're not doing 70 lot subdivision, you're doing 2 lot, 3 lot subdivisions. And you're doing in these areas where the council actually promotes, density. So the council wants people, to, split the bigger blocks into smaller blocks. So, they've called it out in the zone planning schemes. A lot of this is called upon. So there's a high level of surety into, finding some of these properties as to, okay, what you can do with these properties and what council will allow.
Yeah, fantastic, awesome. And what are other ways that you can, or investors can consider as to how they can break out of this serviceability trap as well, other than small scale developments?
Well, as I said, there's a lot of ways, and yield is one way to look at it. Adding more yield into your portfolio, and majority of the time, that's what people would do. But also, focusing not just on the single strategy, but
Moss, let me know if you can hear me. It was a bit of a connection issue.
I can hear you. I think I lost you for for 2 seconds, I think.
Yeah, so we're still alive. Great that we're back. I'll just have a look if there are any more questions since. Cool, all good. I left you at what are other ways of unlocking serviceability potential, breaking through the serviceability trap,
Yes.
other than small scale developments?
And look, it comes down to creating more income. Yeah. So easiest way people think about coming out of these serviceability traps is by generating more income. Now, either you work hard enough to create more income for yourself, or start up your own business, or take on some much more complicated sort of investment profiles where you're thinking about roaming houses, NDIS, where these are high yield sort of investments. The other way, or a vanilla way to look at some of these, is adding these yield properties, high yield properties into your portfolio as well, where you might be sacrificing on growth, but you'll temporarily get high yield or high income from some of these properties. Then bank would be able to use that against your serviceability. So there's a few ways you can do them, but where I say or tend to tell people is that focus on yield with growth. Don't just discount the growth completely. So that's the most important sort of concept.
Yeah, awesome. And for those who might have questions, how can they get in touch? Or maybe you'll leave a link in the comments for anyone who are interested in seeing what are some of the common questions that people might be thinking about at the moment, and what would you recommend, or how can they reach out? Actually, we've got a question here from Matthew. But what happens past the point you acquire the low growth yield in order to gain serviceability? So what happens past the point that you acquire the low growth yield in order to gain serviceability?
Well, the thing is that as soon as you've acquired a property with high yield, low growth, what is going to happen is that the bank is going to look at those properties and assume the rental income that comes out of these properties as your own income. And because you would be making more money on these properties versus the repayments, the bank would naturally release or give you some of that borrowing back to you. So it's not humongous. And that's where the bottleneck is. You would have to add a few properties before you can, reach out and create, enough serviceability for yourself. So it's not that an extra $10,000 a year is going to get you $1 million in serviceability. That's not how it works, So, the serviceability criteria is still the same. The earnings that you are going to get is usually multiple of 7. So if you're making 10,000, the bank is going to give you 70. If you make 100, the bank would naturally assume that you can service a $700,000 loan. So that's the sort of cycle that you're looking at, So you would probably have to add an extra 50,000 in income for you to get an extra 500,000 in serviceability.
Yep. Awesome. And James is in here. Great live. Appreciate your knowledge. Thanks, you for putting this together. All good, James. And Matthew, I hope that answers your question. If we don't get to answer it by the time we wrap it up, actually he's here. So it's about continually adding these high yield properties every so often. That's the question he's asked.
Well, I would go the other way, Matthew. I would say that it's not so much about adding the high yield properties. I would suggest you going down the path of adding a property with the development potential. And, and we can go back and talk about this again, or we can talk offline about these things too. But earlier in the process, we were talking about these things. Adding a small scale development potential property basically gives you the same impact as adding a lot of high yield, low growth properties. What's the major difference between the two is a development potential property would help you come out of the serviceability trap quicker with profit, so that you can go back and do it again. Versus high yield properties would only enable you to add another high yield or high growth property, and that's where it stops.
Awesome, Moss. So, guys, if you have any questions, I'll get Moss to drop his calendar link into the comments below for those who might be experiencing the serviceability trap or have inquiries on how to or have questions around some of the things that we've discussed today. I'll get Moss to drop that in there after this. And if you have any other questions and you're watching this on the replay, do drop your questions in the comment anyway. That way we can continue to create more value content for you guys inside this group. Thank you from Matthew says, thank you. We'll be in touch shortly. Awesome. We'll leave you the link and take care, guys. Until next time, we'll try and keep this a weekly thing. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Ciao. Bye now.
Bye for now.
Bye.